The house was quiet now. It was always quiet around this time. 3 in the morning, the hour when even the tough guys stopped pretending to be brave. The hour when sleep came slow, and shadows stretched longer than they should have. Thomas Gioeli sat in his chair, hands resting on his lap. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen behind him the only thing reminding him he was still alive. Rain tapped gently at the window. Not hard, not dramatic, just enough to make the streets slick and the past feel a little closer. His body ached in small ways. Age wasn't a thief, it was a slow erosion, like the sea licking away at rock, quiet and patient. His knees gave little cracks when he stood, his back tensed for no reason, and sometimes his fingers wouldn't obey when he reached for a glass. But it wasn't age that made sleep so difficult. It was memory. Back in the day, the real days, not the stories people read online. Things moved slower. Brooklyn wasn't clean and polished like it tried to be now. It smelled like hot pretzels, cigarettes, grease from corner pizza joints, and old rain soaked into brick. You knew who ran what by the look in their eye. A nod at the deli meant more than a contract. Tommy Shots, they called him. Thomas Gioeli, a name spoken in bars with half fear, half respect, not the flashiest boss, not the bloodiest, but steady, sharp. The kind of guy who watched before he spoke. And remembered what you said even if you thought he didn't. He hadn't been meant for the life, not originally. His old man drove trucks. His mother, Sicilian-born, prayed too much and trusted the wrong people. The kind of woman who kept a rosary in one pocket and a kitchen knife in the other. For different kinds of devils. But Brooklyn had a way of bending your future. Some kids went to school, others learned on the stoop. And Tommy, he listened, he learned, and he kept quiet. By the time he was in his 20s, he'd already done enough quiet things for loud men that people started giving him space when he walked into a room. But tonight was about none of that. Tonight was about the dreams. They'd started slow years ago. A face he hadn't seen in decades showing up in sleep, saying nothing. Just standing in the corner, watching. Then others came, old crew, rivals, even a girl he'd once danced with in some summer block party. When life felt like it might take him somewhere else, he never feared bullets. Not really. But dreams didn't play fair. They came when you were weak, when your guard was down, and they whispered things that stuck with you long after morning. The rain outside was steady now, and somewhere in the distance, a car passed over a puddle with a low splash. It reminded him of the nights he used to cruise the Belt Parkway. That deep, open silence of the water just past the guardrail, the city stretched behind him and deals ahead. He sipped coffee. Cold now, but the bitterness kept him anchored. They said he was involved in too many cases. Bank robberies, hits, even the murder of a cop from way back. Most of it, he never admitted, never would. There were things you kept to yourself, not out of fear but out of principle. Still, some names didn't fade so easily. Ralphie, Dino, Sammy, Nails, all part of the stories the Frieds tried to stitch together, like a bad quilt made of whispers and wiretaps. And yet pieces of those stories were true, pieces only he remembered right. He closed his eyes. In that moment, the rain outside softened again. The room felt warmer, his breathing slowed steady. For a second, just a second, he was back in the 70s. Standing outside Tilden High School, leather jacket zipped up to his neck, hands in his pockets, waiting for someone who never showed up. A small heartbreak that turned him harder. Funny the things that come back first. Sleep, when it came, didn't last long, but it was deep enough to pull him under. In that sleep, he wasn't Tommy Shots. He wasn't a headline or a file or a court date. He was just a boy from Brooklyn, listening to his mother's prayers through a bedroom wall, wondering if the world had a place for someone like him. The morning light barely cracked through the old, yellowed blinds. It spilled across the floor like a secret creeping in. Thomas stirred, not fast, not startled, just aware. The kind of wakefulness that came from years of not trusting deep sleep. His joints groaned like old floorboards when he shifted in the chair, bones clicking into place, stiff from sitting too long. The TV was still on, volume low, playing some black and white movie. He didn't recognize the scene, probably something about loyalty or war or both. Those themes always followed him around, even in fiction. He rose slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the table for balance. The cold had crept into the bones of the house during the night. Even with the heater groaning from the basement, there were corners of this place that stayed frozen. A reminder, maybe, that some parts of life never thaw. He walked into the kitchen. His slippers slid slightly on the linoleum tile, worn to a dull shine. The coffee maker sat there, blinking 1200 as it always did. He never set the time. No need. Time had stopped mattering the day he got pinched. Maybe even before that. As the coffee brewed, he stared out the window. The backyard was bare. A couple of metal chairs sat under a leafless tree. Squirrels darted across the fence like they had urgent business. Everything looked so normal out there, so boring. But he knew the ghosts that floated just under the surface. This house wasn't just a house. It was once a safe place, then a hideout, then a prison with nice wallpaper. Over the years, people had visited it who never should have. Men who came in the middle of the night with blood on their shirts. Lawyers who whispered like priests. Cops who smiled like hyenas. And women, some who brought comfort, others who stole it the moment they left. But none of them stayed. Only Thomas did. He took his mug to the table and sat. The wood was scratched, the finish long faded, but it held stories. Deals made, lines drawn, names mentioned in low tones. He could still feel the ghost of cigar smoke hanging above it. He took a sip of coffee and let the heat linger in his chest. Then, without even meaning to, his mind drifted back. Again, that quiet rewind that started every morning now, like a film reel stuck on loop. This time it went further back to the time before he was anyone worth remembering. It was 1966, and the neighborhood smelled like hot tar and roasted chestnuts. He was 14. Scrawny, sharp-eyed, already taller than his father but thinner than the shadow he cast. His mother kept telling him to eat more. She worried about him, not because he was in trouble, but because she knew trouble was circling. Mothers know. They always do. Thomas was the kind of kid who paid attention to the things people didn't say. He noticed how the butcher gave Mr. Miano a different kind of nod than he gave everyone else. He saw the way the neighborhood kids stopped talking when certain cars pulled up. He heard whispers. Colombo, Persico, Union, Ode. He didn't understand it all. Not yet. But he liked how power moved quiet, efficient, like smoke slipping under doors. His first brush with that world came on a cold Thursday afternoon. A guy named Nicky Molinaro, mid-level, always smiling too wide, asked him to do something simple. Tommy? Nicky said, tossing him a quarter. Go down to Tony's and tell him it's time to fix the Tuesday book. You do that right, I'll let you keep the change from your egg sandwich. Thomas did it. Didn't ask questions. Delivered the line, got his sandwich and returned. Nicky smiled. Good. You got ears. And you got balls. Thomas didn't even know what he'd done, but something in his chest swelled that day. Not pride, something sharper. The beginning of identity. A name becoming something more. After that, little jobs came in waves. Drop-offs. Messages. Keeping an eye on who went where. Never dangerous. Not at first, that came later. His father worked long hours, too tired to notice much. His mother was buried in her church group and her rosaries. And Thomas, he was slipping through the cracks, exactly where someone like Nicky wanted him. That summer, something changed. A local kid named Benny, Beans, Morello got jumped behind the pizza shop. Word on the street said he'd mouthed off about somebody's girl and somebody's money. By morning, Beans had a broken nose and 2 missing teeth. Thomas saw it happen. He didn't step in. Didn't flinch, just watched. Later, Nicky asked, "What'd you see?" Thomas answered honestly. Told him who threw the first punch, who held Beans down, what they said. Nicky stared at him for a long time, then nodded. You got good eyes, kid. And just like that, Thomas was in. Years later, when he was known, when the name, Tommy Shots, made headlines and whispers in dark bars, he would still remember that look Nicky gave him. That look was the start, the beginning of the path that led to prison gates, FBI files, and dreams full of dead men. But in those early days, it wasn't about power. Not really. It was about belonging. Thomas didn't crave violence. He wasn't one of those. He didn't beat his chest or talk too much. But he understood rules, especially the ones unspoken. Loyalty, respect, silence. He learned how to navigate rooms full of older men, how to wait, how to be invisible when needed, and unforgettable when it mattered. By the time he was 20, he had done more for the Colombo family than most guys twice his age. Still not made, but close. Trusted. There was one night that haunted him more than others. Not because it was violent, but because it almost wasn't. He was riding in the back of a car, heading toward a warehouse in Red Hook. A man named Carlo Bianchi sat in the front. Carlo was mid-tier muscle, known for a temper and a twitchy right hand. That night, he was supposed to scare someone. A warning, not a hit. Thomas was there to observe. That was the cover. But when they arrived, the guy, some union rep who owed too much and talked too freely, got mouthy. Started threatening to go to the press. Carlo snapped. One shot. Just one. Right through the throat. Thomas didn't move. He watched the man fall, gasping, hands clawing at his neck like he was trying to pull the bullet out. The silence afterward was so complete, Thomas could hear his own breath shaking in his chest. Carlo wiped his gun like it was routine. You didn't see nothing, he muttered. And Thomas, voice calm, replied, I never do. That line followed him for years. Back in the kitchen, the coffee was cooling fast. Thomas sat with both hands around the mug, eyes distant. He wasn't sad. Not exactly. More like hollow. There were things he did that couldn't be undone. Names that still echoed. Faces that waited for him in dreams. But the worst of it, the part that gnawed at him during nights like this, he missed it. Not the blood, not the power plays, not the prison cells or the crook cops. He missed the belonging. He missed walking into a diner and getting silent nods from 5 different guys who owed him favors. He missed the weight of knowing secrets nobody else did. He missed the purpose. Now, he was just a name in a file. A ghost in a world that moved on. Even the new kids in the street barely knew him. They played gangster on Instagram. Posed with guns they didn't know how to clean. Talked big. Died quick. He wasn't built for that world. He came from something quieter, deadlier, older. The rain had stopped. The backyard glistened like wet glass under the pale morning light. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, then went quiet. Thomas rubbed his eyes. Today would be slow. They all were now. But tonight the dreams would come again. They always did after mornings like this, and when they did, he knew whose face would appear first. Not the guys he outlawed. Not the ones he buried. No, it would be his brother, Vincent. The one who never even touched the life, but ended up paying the price for being blood. That story hurt to tell, but it was coming. Like all ghosts, eventually they demand to be remembered. The coffee was half gone by the time he noticed the sky had cleared. The sun pushed gently through the clouds, not with force but like a whisper. Hesitant, as if it knew it didn't quite belong in this story. Thomas sat still at the kitchen table, eyes locked on the backyard but seeing nothing in it. His fingers tapped lightly on the side of the mug, not from nerves but from rhythm. The same way a man taps out a tune he's heard too many times. It was always Vincent's face that showed up first. Always. Not in the loud moments, but in the quiet ones, like this, when the hum of the refrigerator seemed too loud and the silence in the walls too deep. Thomas hadn't spoken his brother's name in years, not out loud. Not even in court when the prosecutors tried to drag every part of his life into the light. They'd asked about family. He said little, because this part, Vincent's part, wasn't for them. It was for the silence, for the spaces between dreams. It started like most tragic stories do, with love, not the kind you read about, not fireworks and poetry, just love, brotherly, simple, unspoken. Vincent was 3 years younger, softer, kinder, always the one who smiled when someone else was hurting. The kind of kid who'd fix a neighbor's broken gate without being asked, a boy who believed in the good in people, even in Brooklyn. Their mother loved Vincent differently. Not more, not less, but differently. She saw his heart, saw the gentleness in him, and tried to protect it like a fragile glass in a cabinet full of iron pots. She didn't know the world doesn't care about fragile things. Thomas was already running small jobs by the time Vincent hit 14. That was the year Vincent told him he wanted to be a teacher. A teacher. Thomas had said, eyebrows raised, cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth. You want to stand in front of kids all day and tell em what to do. Vincent had grinned. Somebody's got to teach em right. Before the wrong people get to em. Thomas had smirked then, but the word stayed with him. He didn't say it out loud, but he was proud. Proud that Vincent wasn't like him. Proud that one of them still believed in something. But pride was a dangerous thing in their world. You take pride in the wrong thing, and it becomes a target. Vincent stayed clean, never joined, never asked questions. When Thomas would come home late with his knuckles scraped raw or his eyes too tired, Vincent would just nod, offer him tea, and say nothing. But the streets knew. The streets always know. And sometimes being close to the game, even if you're not playing, is enough to get you hurt. It happened in '79. A cold February night, snow on the ground but dirty already. Brooklyn's snow never stayed clean. Thomas was 27, already running his own little crew under the Colombo umbrella. He was careful, tight with money, tight with trust, and already known as someone who didn't flinch. That night he'd just come back from a meeting near Bensonhurst. A dispute over vending contracts had gone sideways. Some young bloods had stepped out of line, and someone needed to remind them where they stood. But that wasn't the part he remembered. He remembered walking up the steps to his mother's house, his boots tracking in slush, and hearing crying. Not wailing, not loud, just quiet, broken crying, like someone trying not to wake the dead. It was his mother, sitting on the floor by the phone. Vincent had been jumped on his way back from tutoring at the church school. 3 guys, masks on, bats and chains, no words, no warning, just violence. They left him in the alley behind St. Theresa's. Broken ribs, a cracked jaw. Two fingers snapped in ways they weren't meant to bend. He lived. Barely. Thomas never forgot how his mother looked that night, not angry, not devastated. Just hollow. Like something sacred had been taken and she didn't know where to put the pain. Vincent wouldn't talk about it. Not to the cops, not to Thomas, not even to the priest. He just laid in bed, wired jaw clenched shut, eyes refusing to meet his brothers. But Thomas didn't need words. He knew. It wasn't random. Couldn't be. The message was simple. We can reach him. We can hurt what you love. The streets were talking. Quietly but enough. Whispers of a debt gone bad. A favor refused. A sit-down that didn't go the way someone hoped. And now revenge. Thomas remembered standing outside that hospital room, smoke curling from his cigarette like a noose. He didn't say anything to anyone. Just stared out the window, watching the snow fall again. This time, it felt personal. That week 3 bodies showed up in 3 different parts of Brooklyn. All tied to the crew that had caused the original beef. No arrests, no leads. But the message was sent back. You don't touch family. Vincent healed, slowly. But something inside him changed. The light behind his eyes dimmed. He stopped tutoring. Stopped going to the church. Stopped dreaming out loud. One night, a year later, he told Thomas, I'm moving to Long Island. I got a job teaching out there. Fresh start. Thomas nodded, said he was proud, helped him pack, gave him a car, made sure nobody followed him. But when the door closed when Vincent was gone, Thomas broke. Not loud, just a quiet kind of broken. Because he knew his brother had been driven out. Not by him directly, but by the life that followed him like smoke. The life he chose. Back in the present, Thomas blinked slowly. The memory faded like breath on cold glass, fogging and clearing at the same time. The kitchen was silent again. The mug was empty. He stood, rinsed it out without thinking, then walked to the window. His hand rested on the sill, fingers curled slightly like he could still feel the shape of that old car key he once gave to Vincent. He never visited Long Island, never called. Not once. They spoke through letters, twice a year, birthday, Christmas. Vincent never blamed him, not in writing. But the silence between the lines, it told the truth. And now, after all these years, Thomas didn't even know if his brother was alive. He could have found out, could have asked someone, but he didn't. Because if he found out Vincent had died, alone, away from everything they ever knew, it would be the one thing he couldn't bury. Not in court, not in sleep, not even in death. It was almost noon now. The sun was higher, brighter, but it didn't reach far in this house. Thomas rubbed his eyes and sat down again. His hands, once steady enough to tie knots and load guns in the dark, trembled just slightly. He wasn't afraid of dying, but he was afraid of being forgotten. Not by the men in the papers. Not by the kids who thought they knew his name. By him. By Vincent. That's what the dreams were really about. Not the bodies. Not even the betrayals. They were about the one person he'd loved cleanly. And lost anyway. The past never disappears in a gangster's life. It sits in the silence, waits in the corners, and climbs into your bed like a ghost with cold hands. Tonight, when the dreams come again, Thomas knows what he'll see. Not a hit. Not a courtroom. Not even his own crimes. But a younger version of himself, standing on the stoop in Brooklyn, watching his little brother ride off to a better life, and wondering if he did the right thing by letting him go. The rain returned in the afternoon, steady and unbothered. Brooklyn had this way of turning every storm into background music, soft, forgettable, but always there. Thomas sat in the den now, lights off, television flickering quietly with the volume down. Some show he didn't recognize. Too bright, too fake. He turned it off. The house creaked around him. Every house built before 1950 had a sound. Not loud, more like breath. As if the walls themselves remembered things too. And this one, it remembered everything. He reached for the drawer next to his chair, slow and easy, and pulled out a small wooden box, not locked. It didn't need to be. Nobody came around anymore. Inside was nothing special, at least not to anyone else. Some old letters. A silver lighter that didn't work. A broken cufflink. A photo of 5 men standing outside a restaurant in Bensonhurst. All of them smiling. All of them dead, except him. He stared at the picture a long time, then picked up the cufflink. It had once belonged to a man named Johnny Gioeli. And just like that, his mind opened the door to a memory he hadn't walked through in years. Johnny was old school. Older than Thomas by a decade, maybe more. He was one of those guys who had grown up in the smoke of the 50s, when loyalty wasn't something you said. It was something you lived. He wore suits in summer, tipped everyone with cash, and never raised his voice unless it was in prayer or rage. When Thomas was just cutting his teeth in the family, Johnny had been the gatekeeper. Not officially, no. Officially, he was just another made guy. But behind closed doors, he was the one who sized people up. Not just for jobs, but for trust, and once for something worse. Thomas was in his early 30s running a small gambling circuit out of Bay Ridge, numbers mostly no drugs. Clean work, easy to manage, steady profit. He'd earned respect, earned fear, people saw his face and remembered it. That was all he wanted. But one night, everything tilted. It started with a sit down in the back of a restaurant called Capri's, candlelight, cheap wine. Real linen on the tables even if it was stained. At the table sat Frankie Taglian, one of the underbosses. Next to him, Johnny, and next to Johnny, a kid named Mikey Spano, fresh-faced, too eager, always grinning like he hadn't seen enough of the world yet. Thomas had brought Mikey in 2 years earlier, gave him small jobs, taught him how to listen more than speak. He saw promise in the kid, a quiet hunger, not too loud, not sloppy. Useful. But lately, Mikey had been nervous, sweaty, asking questions he shouldn't ask. "Tommy," Frankie said that night, his fingers around a glass of Chianti, "you got eyes on your boy Spano?" Thomas blinked slowly. "Always." "Why?" Frankie leaned back. "'Cause we got whispers. Things that make us itch." Johnny didn't say a word, just looked at Thomas over the rim of his glass. Eyes like two stones in a still pond. Thomas didn't flinch. "What kind of things?" Frankie shrugged. "Not enough to act. Not yet. But enough to make us watch." And then Johnny finally spoke. "There's a test coming. We want you to handle it." Thomas tilted his head. "You want me to test Mikey?" Johnny nodded. "We need to know who he is. Before the feds find out for us." The air turned heavy. There were no instructions. That was the test. Thomas had to figure it out. If Mikey was clean, great. If he wasn't, Thomas had to clean it up, quietly, without question. That night Thomas didn't sleep. Not because he was afraid. Because he didn't want to be right. He watched Mikey for a week, nothing obvious. No meetings with strangers. No tale, no sudden cash flow. But something didn't sit right. Mikey had stopped showing up to Sunday dinners. He used to bring wine, tell stories, laugh too loud. Now, he was quiet, late, distracted. Then came the slip. Tuesday night, Mikey was supposed to drop off a cash envelope at a laundry spot in Sunset Park, one of their fronts. Easy job. Been doing it for months. But when Thomas called the shop, they said nobody came by. 2 hours later, Mikey showed up, sweating, stammering, saying he got held up with a girl in Queens. Thomas didn't say anything, just nodded. The next day, he drove to Queens. Asked around, checked a few places. Mikey hadn't been with a girl. He'd been sitting in a car alone, across from a federal building, watching. That night, Thomas made his decision. They met in a park near the water, quiet, late, barely any lights. Mikey showed up in a hoodie and jeans, hands in his pockets. "You said it was urgent," he said. Thomas didn't respond at first, just looked out at the water. "You remember when I picked you up, Mikey?" he asked. "You were running numbers for a guy who underpaid and overtalked." Mikey nodded slowly. "Yeah, you showed me how to do it right." Thomas nodded. "And I told you, day one, the only thing you can't do in this life is lie to the people who would die for you." Silence. Then Mikey said, "Tommy, I swear." But Thomas cut him off. "Don't." Another pause. "Then I saw you outside the Fed building." Mikey's breath caught. Just for a second. That was all the proof he needed. "I didn't talk to anyone," Mikey whispered. "I swear to God, Tommy. I just went. I was curious, that's all. I just wanted to know what they knew. I didn't say anything. I didn't give anything." Thomas turned and looked at him. Really looked. Mikey looked like a child. Scared. Small. But the rule was simple. Even wanting to talk was a betrayal. And betrayal was death. "I don't want to die," Mikey said, voice cracking now. "I didn't mean nothing by it, please." Thomas stared at him for a long time. Then, softly, he said, "I believe you." Mikey's eyes lit up with hope. And then Thomas pulled the gun from his coat and shot him twice. Once in the chest, once in the head. Quick. Clean. No screaming. No mess. He buried him by the old fishing pier, where the water ran deep and the memories sank faster than bodies. Back in the den, Thomas held the broken cufflink. It had come off Mikey's wrist that night, caught in the gravel. He kept it. Not as a trophy. As a wound. Because that was the moment something changed in him. Not because he'd pulled the trigger. He'd done worse before. But because he believed Mikey. And still pulled the trigger. It was the first time the life made him choose between truth and loyalty. And he chose loyalty. That was the day he became more than a soldier. That was the day he became a man the bosses could trust with anything. But something inside him went cold. And it never thought again. The rain picked up outside, tapping harder now. Thomas looked at the picture again. The one of him, Johnny, Frankie, and the rest, all of them gone now, dead. Shot, flipped, vanished. He was the last. The one who did what had to be done. the one who carried every silence. And tonight, he knew Mikey would visit again. In dreams, not angry, not violent. Just standing there, still young, still waiting for the apology Thomas never gave. Power never comes like thunder. Not in this world. It doesn't crash in with fists or fanfare. It slips in like fog under a doorframe, like a chill you don't notice until it's too late to get warm. When Thomas Gioeli was officially promoted to Caporigine, Capo, it didn't come with a ceremony. No trumpet. No crowd. Just a quiet not over a half-eaten plate of calamari in the back of a seafood joint in Sheepshead Bay. The man doing the nodding was Gregory, the fixer, Mancini, a name no one said too loudly, even in rooms with thick walls. "You're ready," Gregory had said, almost like a confession. "We need someone quiet, smart, someone who don't gotta scream to get listened to." Thomas said nothing at first. Just took a sip of red wine. It tasted like rust and something older, like a church that forgot how to pray. Gregory passed him a small envelope. Inside it was a list, 6 names. 5 of them he recognized, men who now answered to him. The sixth would change everything. Dom Russo, that was the 6th name, and even reading it made something shift in Thomas's chest. Not pain, not exactly. Just a kind of warning hum. Like standing on a bridge that's too quiet. Dom wasn't a bad man. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't greedy. But he was proud, and pride in the world Thomas lived in was a loaded gun with no safety. Dom had run his own little crew under a different capo. Tony Bresciano, now dead, heart attack during a sit-down about union money. Tony's death left a vacuum, and the family did what it always did, reshuffled, reassigned, rewrote history. Thomas got the nod, and with it he inherited Dom. But some men don't like being inherited. They met at Luigi's Pizza, a corner joint they both knew well. Plastic tablecloths, bad Sinatra on the radio, a waitress who kept calling Thomas horny, like he was her nephew. Dom showed up wearing a gray coat that made him look like a ghost. He sat down without speaking, poured himself a glass of water, and stared at Thomas across the table like they were strangers. "I heard," he said. Thomas nodded. "It's official." Dom looked down at the table. "No offense, Tommy, but I've been doing this longer than you." Thomas said nothing. Dom added, "I had Bresciano's ear for 15 years. His respect, I ran this side of Gravesend for over a decade. And now I'm supposed to report to you." Thomas stirred his coffee, slow and calm. "That's the life." "Yeah." Dom muttered. There was a long pause. Then Thomas leaned in slightly. Not aggressive. Just enough to shift the air. "I don't want your turf. I don't want your crew. But I'm the one they gave the books to. And if we don't figure out how to breathe the same air, one of us stops breathing. You understand?" Dom didn't answer, but he didn't nod either. Just finished his water, stood up, and said, "You ain't Bresciano." Then he left. Thomas didn't react. Not then, but inside he knew. Dom wasn't angry, he was waiting. And that was worse, because a man who waits doesn't strike when you expect it. He strikes when you trust him. Over the next few months, things stayed quiet. Too quiet. The numbers came in. The drop-offs were smooth, no fights, no turf issues. Even the cops seemed to ease up, like the streets themselves were trying to lull Thomas to sleep. But he didn't sleep, he watched. Dom showed up to meetings, said all the right things. Even offered Thomas a Cuban cigar once, unlit, perfect, expensive. Said he picked it up in Florida. Thomas took it, smiled, didn't smoke it. When Dom left, he broke the cigar in half. Inside was a note. "You're not untouchable." That night Thomas sat alone in his car outside a bakery on 18th Avenue. Windows fogged, radio off. A gun in his lap and a thought circling his brain like a vulture. How do you kill a man the family won't let you touch? The truth was you don't. You wait, you listen, and you hope he makes the first move. 3 weeks later Dom did. It was small, almost unnoticeable. A card game that wasn't authorized. A few envelopes that came up short. One of Thomas's runners, Stevie Masco, showed up with a bruise on his face and a story he didn't want to tell. Thomas sat Stevie down in a diner and poured him coffee. "You tell me what happened," he said low and quiet. "Not what you think I want to hear, not what's safe. The truth." Stevie hesitated. Then whispered, "Dom's taking side money. And he's telling guys you're soft. That you only got your button 'cause Mancini liked you." Thomas didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Just said, "Go home. Forget we talked." Then he got in his car and drove for hours. He didn't want to kill Dom. Not because he was afraid. But because if he did it without approval, he'd be the one buried next. And the family. It didn't care about personal pride. It only cared about structure, balance, the illusion that everything was under control. So Thomas did something harder than pulling a trigger. He waited, he watched. And one night, just after Christmas, Dom slipped. It was small. He took a package. unmarked, heavy, from a guy nobody recognized, passed it through a back door near the docks. No witnesses, no paperwork except one. A camera. Thomas had paid a longshoreman to keep an eye on Dom's movements. Guy was clean. No tase, just owed a favor. And the picture he got crystal clear. Dom. Package. A handshake with someone who wasn't from their world. Not Irish, not Italian, Feds maybe. Or worse, Russians. Thomas didn't go to Mancini. He went straight to Sal Cardinale, the consigliere. The man who really moved the pieces. They met in a funeral parlor after hours. Just 2 chairs, a single lamp, and the quiet scent of lilies that clung to the air like sadness. Thomas slid the photo across the table. Sal looked at it, then looked at Thomas. "You want permission?" Sal said. Thomas nodded. Sal stared at the picture again, then folded it slowly, like it was delicate. "You got it?" No speech, no ceremony, just quiet approval. And that was all Thomas needed. He waited 1 more week. Let the weather turn. Let Dom get comfortable. Then, on a Wednesday night, rain slicking the streets like oil, Thomas walked into a small warehouse where Dom was counting money with 2 of his men. He didn't speak, just raised the gun. 2 shots for the guards, 1 clean bullet for Dom, straight between the eyes. No struggle, no drama, just silence. Afterward he cleaned the scene, burned the ledgers, dumped the bodies in the East River, and went home. That night he slept, for the first time in weeks, but his dreams weren't peaceful. Dom was there, standing in a field, not angry, just disappointed. "You were supposed to protect us," Dom said. Thomas didn't reply, because in the dream even he knew it was true. Back in the present, Thomas stood in the kitchen, hand resting on the edge of the counter. The coffee had long gone cold, untouched. Outside, the rain tapped a rhythm only he understood. Power, he'd learned, never came for free. It came with weight, with silence, with shadows that didn't speak, but never left. And somewhere out there, someone else was telling this story differently. Someone was saying Thomas betrayed Dom, that he rose by cutting the legs out from under another man. Maybe they were right. But Thomas didn't rise to be liked. He rose to survive, and survival in the life he chose came with blood. And sleep came like a thief. When it came at all, the first time he saw the van, he ignored it. White, parked just outside the corner deli, windows 2 clean, antenna 2 straight. Nobody sat inside, or at least nobody visible. It was cold that morning, February cold, where your breath stung on the way out and your coat never felt thick enough. Thomas walked past it slow, coffee in one hand, newspaper under his arm. Didn't glance too long, didn't pause, just noticed. It was gone the next day. But it came back, again and again. That's how they did it. The feds, they didn't kick in doors. Not right away. They watched, they waited, they collected. And then, when you felt like maybe you were in the clear, when your shoulders dropped and your eyes stopped darting, they moved in. With papers. With proof. With your name printed in ink and filed under organized crime. Thomas knew the playbook. He'd read it, from both sides. What he didn't know, at least not yet, was who opened the door for them. Because someone had. Someone always does. It started small. A conversation he wasn't supposed to know about. 2 guys talking too freely in the back room of a pool hall, thinking the jukebox was loud enough to cover them. "You know he's next, right? Gioeli. They're sniffing around." The other man's voice was cautious. "Tommy shots? Nah, he's clean. Always been careful. Doesn't matter. They're building something." Said his name came up more than once. Thomas heard it from the bartender later. A kid he once bailed out of a gambling debt, who now kept his ears open out of gratitude. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. Not because he was afraid of going down, but because he couldn't figure out who'd cracked. He'd cleaned his crew over the years. Cut the weak ones, killed the dangerous ones. Kept a tight circle, the kind of loyalty you couldn't buy, only bleed for. But somehow they were still inside. The next sign came a week later. He was meeting Sal Cardinale, the consigliere, in the basement of a church they used for quiet talks. A priest with loose lips and empty donation boxes had let them use the space for years. But this time Sal arrived rattled. Not scared, just tight. He tossed a newspaper on the table. FBI opens broad investigation into Colombo family activity. Thomas stared at the headline. Below it, a list of names, not formal charges, just associates of interest. His name was third. He didn't blink, just folded the paper slow. "They're poking," he said. "They're doing more than poking," Sal replied. "They've been talking to lawyers. Trying to flip guys. Offering deals. Anyone bite?" Sal hesitated. "Not yet." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Not that I know of," Sal corrected. That was the worst part. Not knowing. You can kill a man, threaten him. Pay him. You can deal with a man you see. But what do you do with a voice you can't hear? A tape recorder hidden under a seat, a wire taped to a chest, a face in a room that smiles at you while delivering your name to people in suits. That's not a war. That's drowning. He called a crew meeting the following night. Nothing big, just the core five. They met in the back of a butcher shop late, after hours. Meat hooks swayed slightly in the cold air, but the smell was clean. A little bleach, a little blood, a little old history baked into the tile. Thomas sat at the head of the table. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't pound the table. Didn't threaten. He just looked at each of them, one by one. Angelo, quiet, loyal, ran numbers with discipline. Paulie Z, loudmouth, but smart when it counted. Lou Ferraro, the clean one, who wore gloves even when he didn't need to. Stevie Masco, young, wide-eyed, still trying to earn his bones. Dom Jr., son of an old friend, trying too hard to be respected. Thomas took a sip of water and said, "The feds are circling." Nobody spoke. They got ears somewhere. Eyes? I don't know where it's coming from, but it's close. Too close. Still silence. Thomas leaned in. So if anyone has something they need to say, now's the time. The room stayed still. He scanned their faces. A twitch, a glance, a blink too fast. Nothing. Just 5 loyal men. Or 5 actors. The meeting ended without incident. Plans laid, routes checked. Orders given. No tension on the surface. But when Thomas walked to his car, he saw it again. That same white van. Parked across the street. Engine running. This time he walked straight to it. He didn't knock, didn't speak. Just stared at the tinted window until it rolled down. Inside sat a man in a black windbreaker, plain as day. Short hair. No smile. Eyes like dead bulbs. "A Mr. Gioeli?" the man said. Thomas didn't answer. "We should talk sometime," the man said, casual. "About what?" "About your future." Thomas smirked. "You got a crystal ball." The man didn't laugh. "I got tapes." Then he rolled up the window and drove away. That night Thomas sat alone on his couch. Lights off. TV off. Just the sound of a clock ticking, too loud, like it was counting something down. He reached for his cigarette case, realized it was empty, then left it on the table. He didn't light another. Didn't need the smoke. What he needed was clarity. Because if the feds had tapes, real tapes, that meant only one thing. Someone was talking. And if someone was talking, it had to be someone close. The first thing he did the next day was shut down every single unsecured operation. No more card games. No more collections without double clearance. No phones. No texts. He moved meetings to payphones again. 2-minute talks, coded language. He didn't trust cars. Didn't trust apartments. Didn't even trust his own garage. He began to walk more. Took the train even. Just to listen. Just to see if shadows followed. And sure enough, they did. One morning, while riding the queue line toward Brighton Beach, he spotted a man pretending to read a newspaper. Page upside down. Same face he'd seen near the van. They wanted to be seen now. It was a message. We're not hiding. Thomas had to do the opposite. He had to disappear. Not physically, but emotionally. He stopped calling his daughter. Stopped going to church. Stopped sleeping. The life had always asked him to be silent. Now it demanded something else, to become a ghost while still alive. The first arrest came 2 weeks later. Paulie Z, wire fraud. Tax evasion. Nothing big, but enough to scare him. The next day, Thomas met with Sal again. Is he gonna talk? Thomas asked. Sal shrugged. Paulie's weak. He likes his food, his freedom. He ain't made to sit in a cage. Then get to him before they do. Sal nodded. But 2 days later, Paulie walked free. Case dismissed. Lack of evidence. That was the confirmation. Paulie flipped. They didn't even need to charge him. He just agreed to wear a wire and walk out the front door. Thomas sat in his car outside Paulie's house for 2 hours that night. Didn't move. Didn't cry. Didn't rage. Just sat. And for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be hunted by your own shadow. He didn't kill Paulie. Not yet. That would come later. For now, he just cut him off. Told Sal. Told Mancini. Told the lieutenants. Paulie was radioactive. But the damage was done. The feds had what they needed, a voice from the inside. Back in the present, Thomas stood at the sink, watching the rain streak down the window like slow tears. The coffee had gone cold again. The silence in the house deeper than ever. He hadn't seen Paulie in 15 years now. The man had disappeared into some kind of witness protection hole. New name, new life. But Thomas still heard him in his sleep sometimes. Still saw him walking across that butcher shop floor. Still remembered how many times he called Thomas brother. Trust. That was the word that broke. And once it breaks, you never look at anyone the same again. That's when the real loneliness began. Not when the bullets started. Not when the cell doors closed. But when you realized you couldn't trust the sound of your own name on another man's lips. And sleep. Sleep became a coin toss. One night you'd drift off. The next you'd lie awake, listening to ghosts whisper through the walls. They came in the morning. The sky was still gray. The air outside smelled like cold metal and rain that hadn't started falling yet. Thomas had been standing in the kitchen, warming his hands on a coffee mug that never quite stayed hot long enough. The television was on but silent, some news anchor mouthing stories Thomas no longer believed in. The knock came soft, 3 taps. Not aggressive, not frantic, just enough to make him set the mug down gently. He already knew, even before he opened the door. 2 federal agents stood on the stoop, their suits too stiff, their expressions too calm, like men who were just doing a job no matter how many lives it broke. One of them, the older one, nodded. "Mr. Gioeli, you know why we're here?" Thomas didn't flinch. He looked past them at the street. Quiet, empty. Just a few leaves blowing along the curb. He turned, grabbed his coat from the chair, and stepped outside. No cuffs, no shouting, no neighbors watching from their windows. Just rain beginning to fall as he got into the back seat of the black sedan. The indictment was thick. Over 200 pages of names, dates, wiretaps, transcripts, and quietly folded truths. Thomas didn't read it. His lawyer, Gene Martello, did. A tired man in his 60s who defended more wiseguys than priests had heard confessions. Gene laid it all out in a quiet voice over a prison visit 2 days later. "They're charging you under racketeering, conspiracy to murder, witness tampering, obstruction the works." Thomas sat with his hands folded, calm. Gene added, "They're using testimony from Polly, and someone else. They won't say who, but it's someone close." Thomas nodded once. "They want to offer you a deal," Gene said. Now Thomas looked up. "Gene's you plead. No trial. They let you keep your pension. Supervised release after 10 if you keep your head down." Thomas leaned back. 10 years. 10 years behind bars. For a life he'd already paid for in silence and blood. But the thing about prison wasn't the bars. It wasn't the walls or the guards or even the cold. It was time. Unmoving, unforgiving. Time that crept up on you and started taking your memory piece by piece. Thomas shook his head. "I'm not pleading." Gene didn't argue. "Just close the file." "You sure?" Thomas nodded. "I didn't beg on the streets. I'm not starting in court." The jail wasn't violent. Not like the movies. There were no brawls on day one, no shivs in the shower, just routine, endless routine. Wake up, eat, walk, sit, sleep, repeat. But the silence, the dead kind of silence, was worse than any knife. Thomas shared a block with 15 other men, some old-timers, some young hotheads. Most kept to themselves. All of them knew who he was. They called him Tommy Shots, but not to his face. To his face, they just nodded and kept moving. That suited him fine. His cell was small. Steel bed bolted to the wall, thin mattress. One tiny window that looked out onto a concrete courtyard. Some days, the sunlight hit the corner of the floor, just long enough to remind you the world still turned without you. He didn't decorate, didn't hang photos, didn't write letters. He just sat and thought and remembered. One morning, a guard came by his door. "You got a visitor," he said. Thomas raised an eyebrow. He hadn't requested anyone, not even Gene. In the visiting room behind the bulletproof glass sat a woman he hadn't seen in years. Maria, his daughter. She looked older now. Lines near her eyes, hair darker than he remembered, pulled back in a neat bun. Dressed like she didn't want to be noticed. Thomas picked up the phone on his side of the glass. She did the same. "Hi, Dad," she said, voice soft. He swallowed. They sat in silence for a moment. Then she added, "I saw your name on the news." Again. He smiled faintly. "Figured that might happen. Are you okay?" Thomas looked around. "As okay as you can be in here." She nodded, then looked down. "I didn't know if I should come," she admitted. "But I remembered what Mom used to say. You only visit the living. The dead don't notice." Thomas looked at her closely. She still had her mother's mouth. The same way of biting the corner of her lip when she was nervous. He asked, "Why now?" Maria shrugged. "Because I kept waiting for someone else to visit you. And nobody did." That stung more than anything else. Not because it surprised him, but because it didn't. After she left, he sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. Didn't speak. Didn't move. The silence in prison had a way of pressing on your chest like a weight. It made you remember things you thought you'd buried. Like Vincent, Don Mikey, even Polly. Their faces came back at night, not in dreams, but in flashes. Like old photographs burning slow. Then, one day the guards moved him. No explanation, no warning. Just packed him up and walked him through a series of gray hallways that all smelled like bleach and fear. They placed him in solitary confinement. 23 hours a day, no contact, no light. Just a slot in the door for food and a toilet in the corner. No reason given. But Thomas didn't need one. He knew. The feds were pressuring him, breaking him down, waiting for the silence to feel like punishment instead of peace. At first, it didn't work. He adapted quickly, didn't yell, didn't cry, he simply paced, back and forth, 6 steps one way, 6 steps back. Then he sat, closed his eyes, and thought. That was the thing about isolation. It didn't take your mind. It gave you nothing but your mind. And if your mind was full of ghosts like his was, you didn't sleep. You just floated. He thought of the streets, of walking through Bensonhurst in winter, the crunch of old snow under his boots, the smell of bread baking on 18th Avenue, a dog barking 3 houses down, someone yelling in Italian from a window. He thought of his mother, her hands always moving, stirring, scrubbing, blessing. He thought of Maria as a little girl, clinging to his leg, asking why he never stayed for dinner. He thought of Vincent, standing at the edge of a train platform, saying goodbye without ever saying the word. He thought of the life, what it had promised, what it had taken, what it had left him with. A few weeks into solitary, a letter arrived, slipped under the door. No return address, just one line inside. They're still watching. That was it. No signature, no date. No explanation. Thomas read it 5 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket. He didn't know who sent it. Could have been Maria. Could have been Sal. Could have been someone pretending to be a friend. But he understood the message. Even in here, they wanted him afraid, and yet he wasn't. Not really, because Thomas had spent his whole life watching rooms, watching faces, watching the wind change direction before anyone else noticed. And now, he had nothing left to protect, which made him more dangerous than ever. Late one night, in the middle of silence so deep he could hear his own breath echo off the walls, Thomas finally whispered to himself, "They want me to break." He chuckled once dry, then said louder this time, "Let him wait." And for the first time in weeks, he laid back on his cot and slept, not deep, not peaceful, but real, because he knew something they didn't. The life didn't teach you how to live. It taught you how to endure. And Tommy Schatz, he wasn't done yet. The thing about silence is, if you live in it long enough, you start to hear things. Not real voices, not whispers through the walls, but old sounds that never left. The thud of footsteps down a Brooklyn alley, the zip of a coat in winter, the hum of neon lights outside a deli window at 3 a.m. Thomas had stopped counting days, stopped scratching the wall. Time had folded in on itself like a wet newspaper dissolving in the gutter. But then one morning, or maybe afternoon, it was impossible to tell, something shifted. The slot in his door clicked open, and instead of the usual tray of food, a folded napkin slid through. He stared at it for a long moment. He'd seen this trick before. Napkins were harmless, disposable, innocent, but folded just right, with corners pressed and creases angled, they became envelopes. And this one carried a message. He picked it up, light, no smell, no powder, no weight, just ink. Unfolded carefully, inside was a single sentence, Greenport Bakery, upstairs. The photo is still there, that was it. No name, no signature, no threat, no promise. But Thomas's heart slowed, not sped up, slowed. Because it wasn't just a message, it was a memory. And whoever sent it knew something they shouldn't. Greenport, it wasn't even in the city. It was a sleepy, seaside town out on the North Fork of Long Island, the kind of place retirees and tourists wandered to in the summer. Quiet streets, boats bobbing on calm water, cafes that closed at 6 p.m. He'd only ever been there once, more than 20 years ago. Back then, it was a dead-drop location, a secret hideout used during a brief internal war in the Colombo family, when the streets were too hot and betrayal too common to breathe around. It was during that stretch of chaos that Thomas stayed hidden for 3 days in a bakery's upstairs apartment. Just him, and a single black and white photograph hanging crooked above the radiator. The photo was of a young Italian couple, seated on a bench, heads tilted together. The woman wore a scarf, the man a coat too big for his shoulders. He remembered staring at it for hours. There was something quiet about it, something real. In the middle of all the noise, it was the only thing in the apartment that felt human. He'd always meant to go back and see if it was still there. He never did. Until now. For the photo to be mentioned in a message, here in solitary after months of silence, meant something deep. It meant someone had been there. Not recently. Now. And if they were pointing him back toward it, it wasn't nostalgia. It was a signal. Someone was trying to reach him. Later that week, the guards moved him out of solitary. No explanation. Just, pack up. He didn't ask questions. They transferred him to Gen Pop, general population, in a different unit. Less isolation. More eyes. More noise. At first, he thought it was random. Standard reshuffling. But as soon as he walked into the new block, he knew it wasn't. because sitting in the corner of the common area, pretending to read a magazine, was Lou Ferraro, an old crew member, one of his original, quiet, smart. Wore gloves even when he counted money. A man who disappeared after the indictments came down, not arrested, not named, just gone. Until now, Lou didn't look up, didn't acknowledge him, didn't smile. But when Thomas walked past, he noticed Lou's magazine was upside down. It was a sign. Old school. Don't speak, eyes are watching. Thomas didn't approach him, not right away. He went to his bunk, unpacked slowly, watched. That night, during head count, a piece of string tied to a single shoelace was waiting under his pillow. Another message. The shoelace was red, a color Lou used years ago during drop assignments when he needed to flag something as urgent and internal. Thomas untied the string. Inside was a tightly rolled piece of torn calendar paper. On it, Polly's deal is bigger than we thought. 2 captains flipped. Your name's in the room every day. Sal is gone. Word is he ran. Some say Florida, some say a coffin. And there's talk of a vote. They want to retire your button. Thomas sat back. Read it again. And again didn't react, but inside a switch flipped. Not anger. Not even fear, just clarity. He'd always known Polly flipping would come with consequences. But this, a vote. Retiring his button. That was the gravest insult in the world he came from. Not a bullet, not a prison sentence, but being erased. Stripped of your title, your standing, your identity. It wasn't death, it was undeath. Walking around forgotten, with your name scrubbed from the books. And for the family to even whisper such a thing, that meant someone inside was orchestrating a quiet coup. The next day, during yard time, Thomas took a slow walk around the perimeter. Lou joined him after a lap and a half, never looking directly at him. You read it? Lou asked, voice low, head tilted toward the dirt.
Yeah,
Thomas said. I read it. Lou kept walking. They're scared, not of you. Of what you know. Of what's still buried. They think I'll talk. Lou shrugged. Or die in here? Either way, you're a loose end. Thomas stopped walking for a second, then started again. Where's Sal? He asked. Lou kept his eyes forward. Rumors only. Some say he skipped. Others say he got chopped. Thomas narrowed his eyes. Sal don't skip. No, Lou said. He don't. That meant one thing. Sal was dead. And if Sal, the consigliere, had been silenced, it wasn't the feds. It was internal. The family was cleaning house. That night, Thomas sat on his bunk and stared at the wall. He didn't need to think anymore. He understood the shape of the war now. It wasn't about bullets. It wasn't about wiretaps. It was about history. About stories. About who controlled the narrative. And the only way to survive it was to write his version first. 2 weeks passed. Thomas kept his head down, played cards, ate quietly, read books that didn't matter. But inside he was building a list, a memory map, names, events, mistakes, secrets buried in shallow graves. He didn't trust lawyers, but he trusted himself, so he started writing, in code, in tiny pieces of toilet paper and smuggled napkins. 1 sentence per sheet, nothing that made sense alone. Lou helped him stash them, behind loose tiles, inside the hollow of a table leg, even baked into a paperback novel they'd hollowed out together. Thomas wasn't flipping, but he was documenting, not for the feds, not for revenge, for legacy. So if they buried him, if they erased him, his side of the story wouldn't vanish. Someone someday would read it, and they'd know Thomas Gioeli didn't beg, he didn't betray, and he didn't disappear. On the last night of February, just before lights out, Lou dropped off one final note. It was tucked in a Bible. On the inside cover, Greenport's waiting. No instructions. No date. Just that. Thomas smiled, the first real smile in months, because that meant someone outside was moving pieces. Someone still believed in him. Someone still had his name in their mouth, with respect, and that meant the war wasn't over. It was just beginning. That night Thomas lay on his bunk, hands behind his head, eyes on the ceiling. Sleep came soft. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but deep, because now he had something stronger than anger, stronger than memory, a plan. Brooklyn looked different now. Not louder, not meaner, just different. Cleaner in all the wrong ways. Slick high, rises scraping skies that used to belong to pigeons and clotheslines. Cafes where crews once met replaced by glass, walled offices filled with kids in sneakers and earbuds, talking fast about nothing that mattered. But under it, beneath the new pavement and shiny signs, the city's old bones were still there. You just had to know where to dig. Dino Manetti knew. He'd been gone for a long time. Jersey first, then Vegas. A quiet exile, not forced, not spoken, but understood. Thomas had protected him once long ago. Took a fall so Dino wouldn't have to. Nothing big, just a shuffle with a union guy who got too loud about envelopes and missing pension checks. Thomas took the weight, told the family he acted alone. Dino never forgot. And now, decades later, with Thomas locked away and whispers of betrayal crawling through the streets like rats, Dino came back. Not to fix anything. Not yet. But to listen, to feel the ground. And maybe, just maybe, to pay off a debt time hadn't erased. He landed at LaGuardia with a carry-on bag and a tired look. No gold chains. Just a heavy coat and eyes that had seen too much to be impressed anymore. A car was waiting, not his. A rental nondescript, gray, like the sky. He didn't call anyone. He didn't post pictures. He drove straight to Gravesend, parked 2 blocks from his old barber's shop, and walked the last stretch. The barber shop was still there. The sign had been repainted but crooked, like a drunk had done it with one eye open. Inside, a man named Manny swept hair off the checkered floor, bald now, thinner, but his eyes lit up the second Dino stepped through the door. Well, I'll be damned. Dino smiled. Still charged $20 for a bad haircut. 25 now, Manny said, grabbing him into a half hug. Gotta pay for the wee fee. They talked for a while, light stuff, sports, old names, who died, who didn't. Then Manny leaned close. They say Tommy's done? Dino didn't blink. Who says? Manny shrugged. Same people who said he'd never do time. Same people who once swore you were dead. Dino nodded slowly. Manny's face changed. He's poison now. Rat badge. Still breathing though. Still in the city. Queens. Got a place out in Astoria under his sister's name. Keeps it quiet. Thinks nobody knows. Dino rubbed his jaw. And Sal? Manny looked away. He ain't around anymore. Dino didn't ask how. The look was enough. What about the books? Dino said quietly. You hear anything about a vote? Manny paused, then nodded once. They're talking. Some want Tommy's name gone. Say he's a liability. Dino narrowed his eyes. He was a shield. Now they want to bury the man who kept the door closed for 2 decades. Manny didn't respond. He didn't have to. That night, Dino checked into a motel near Sheepshed Bay. The kind of place that still had metal keys and a front desk that didn't ask for ID if you paid cash. The room smelled like bleach and lost time. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled a faded notepad from his coat. Flipped through the pages, names, numbers. Scars. At the back was a scribbled note from years ago. Tommy's handwriting. If I disappear, tell the truth before they rewrite it. He read it 3 times, then made his first call. Angela Frasco was a journalist, the kind with teeth. She'd spent the last 10 years writing about police corruption, mob history, and cold cases that never made the front page. Most guys in the life hated her. Some respected her. But Dino, he remembered when she was a kid, hanging around her father's sandwich shop, eavesdropping like a sponge with legs. Now she ran a digital crime blog with a cult following. Smart, persistent, and brave enough to knock on doors most people crossed the street to avoid. Dino called from a payphone near Brighton Beach. Angela answered on the second ring. Frasca. It's Manetti. Silence. Then, I thought you were dead. I was. But I heard they're trying to bury Tommy before he is. Angela leaned back in her chair. I'm listening. I've got names. I've got history. And I've got time. Angela didn't hesitate. Meet me tomorrow. Corner booth, Lombardo's Diner. Don't bring a phone. Dino showed up early. Lombardo's hadn't changed much. Still smelled like eggs and burnt toast. Still played Dean Martin like it was a patriotic act. Angela arrived wearing a long coat and a scarf pulled tight. She slid into the booth like someone who didn't trust chairs anymore. You're serious? She asked. As cancer, Dino replied. And you want to talk about Tommy? I want to talk about what they're doing to him. About who's scared of him. About who's making moves while he's locked in a cage. Angela opened a small notebook, no recorder. Just pen and ink. Start at the top, she said. Dino did. He spoke slowly. Talked about the vote. About Sal disappearing. About Polly flipping. About whispers of a false narrative. A plan to stain Tommy's name so deeply. No one would ask why certain people started rising just as he was falling. Angela listened silent, scribbling. When he finished, she closed the notebook. If I publish any of this, you know what happens? Dino nodded. Yeah, they'll either come for me or come faster for Tommy. And that's worth it. Dino didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes said it all. That night, Angela posted an anonymous article on her blog, The Man They Want to Erase Inside the Quiet Coop Against Tommy Shots Gioeli. It didn't name sources, didn't offer hard proof, but it asked questions, and questions are dangerous. Within hours, comments poured in. Some from street names, others from curious law students and crime nerds. The old world was listening, so was the new one. By morning, the piece had been picked up by 2 major podcasts and a local radio host. The spark was small, but it had caught. Back inside the prison walls, Thomas sat at a metal table during morning break, slowly peeling an orange with a plastic spoon. Lou walked past him with a folded piece of paper tucked in a napkin. Thomas didn't touch it right away. He waited, watched, took his time. When he finally opened it, the note said, "Somebody out there's throwing rocks. The pond's moving." Thomas read it twice, smiled faintly, then crushed it in his fist, because he knew what that meant. Someone had lit a fire, and if that fire burned hot enough, it might just reach the inside. Outside, Dino kept moving. He didn't sleep in the same place twice, used burner phones, rode in cabs instead of his own car. But he wasn't running, he was working, collecting, calling old debts, reminding people of what Thomas had done for them. Slowly, a few names started circling back, whispers, help, and maybe, if he pushed hard enough, a way to remind the family that the streets hadn't forgotten who Tommy Shots Gioeli was. And in his motel room under the buzzing light, Dino made a list. Names of the men pushing the vote. The men rewriting the story, the men who stood to gain if Tommy disappeared into silence forever. Then he circled the first name, Gino Trassani. An underboss now. Quiet climber, old rival, the kind of man who smiled with his eyes closed. Dino poured a shot of whiskey, sipped it slow, then whispered into the empty room, "Let's start the second act. They say you can't control anything from inside a cage. But they're wrong. Control isn't shouting orders or waving guns. It's knowing when to wait, when to nod instead of speak, when to pause instead of move, and when to let your enemies believe they've already won." Thomas sat in the yard on a cold bench made colder by the wind. His coat was zipped halfway, hands resting in his lap, knees still strong enough to hold the weight of old decisions. Around him, the prison moved like it always did, not fast, not slow, just steady. A rhythm, men walked the same paths, guards turned the same corners. The same noises echoed off the concrete, but today something was different. Today people were looking, not with fear, not with curiosity, with recognition. Not everyone, just a few, enough. And in prison, a few eyes matter. The article had reached them 2 days ago. Printed out, passed hand to hand. Read in low voices during lockdown. Some inmate with a cousin on the outside had smuggled it and tucked inside a paperback copy of The Godfather. Almost poetic. The man they want to erase inside the quiet coup against Tommy Shots Gioeli. They'd read it twice, 3 times. Tried to figure out who wrote it, but they didn't need to guess the subject. They knew the name. Tommy Shots. Some remembered him from back in the day. Some knew him only by myth. The capo who didn't flinch. The one who rose slow and survived longer than most. Now the story was spreading again, not about crimes but about betrayal. Not about what he did, but what they were doing to him. And something about that stuck, because in a place like prison, betrayal speaks louder than charges. It started small. A younger guy, skinny, tattoos up both arms, maybe 24, walked by Tommy's table in the chow hall and left an orange. Said nothing, didn't look back. The next day, someone offered him a spot in the weight yard rotation without asking. Then a broom was left outside his cell, freshly taped at the handle. These weren't favors, they were signals. Respect. The kind that says, "We haven't forgotten who you are." Lou noticed it too. During breakfast, he slid his tray across from Tommy's and said, "They're watching you again." Thomas stirred his oatmeal. "Let him?" Lou leaned in. "I think they're remembering." Thomas looked up. "Remembering what?" he asked. Lou shrugged. "What the streets looked like when your name meant peace." That line hung in the air, because that was the thing most people forgot. Thomas wasn't a butcher. He didn't run on chaos. He controlled it. He wasn't the guy who wanted war. He was the guy who stopped it from happening. And now that people were talking about a family tearing itself apart from the inside, that legacy started to matter again. Back in the yard, Thomas started walking his loops. Same time every day, not fast, not slow. After 3 days, a new face joined him. Artie DeFranco, 5 years into a weapons charge. Former soldier under the old Kakian crew. Hadn't spoken to Tommy in years. He didn't say hello, just walked beside him. After a lap and a half, he said, "I read the article." Thomas didn't answer. Artie added, "It's true, right? They're trying to dump your name?" Thomas nodded once. Artie looked out at the yard. "They're scared of you." Thomas gave a faint smile. "They should be." Then Artie said the thing that changed everything. "You want this block back? I can help you move pieces." That was the shift. The moment the power, the real power, started bleeding back in. Not with blood. Not with threats. With offerings. Artie controlled the gambling books on the inside. Small time stuff, but consistent. Fights, dice, card tables. He had access communication lines. 2 guards who looked the other way for a few hundred a week. Thomas didn't need money. He needed information. Who was meeting with who? What names were being spoken? Which guys were aligning with which crews, and more importantly, which ones weren't? Artie began feeding him a trickle of intel, soft at first, but enough to map where the tides were moving, and where to place his feet next. Meanwhile, Lou was still working the side hustle, quietly spreading word of a cleanup operation in the family that stank of personal gain. He dropped hints in the yard, in the showers, during church. Just questions. Funny how Sal disappears right after that vote, huh? Don't you think it's weird Paulie's still out free, eating cannoli and pretending he's not wearing a wire? Gino Trassani's never made a move unless someone else did the killing first, and now he's climbing the ladder. Whispers, and whispers, if repeated enough, become truths. Back outside the walls, Dino Manetti hadn't stopped moving either. After the article hit, he'd gone underground, not hiding, preparing. His next step wasn't a blog, it was a dinner. He made calls, chased old numbers. Promised nothing, just conversation. 3 days later, in the back room of a dying steakhouse in Staten Island, 6 men sat around a table. Old captains. 1 former underboss. 2 guys who'd done federal time and kept their mouths shut. They ate in silence. Dino spoke. He laid it out clean. They were letting fear rewrite the past, letting cowards poison names. And if they didn't stop it, they'd wake up one day and realize the code they bled for was just a bedtime story no one told anymore. He wasn't asking for violence. He was asking for memory. He left them with a folder. Inside, names, dates, patterns, proof of Gino's quiet grabs, Paulie's immunity deal, Sal's last known movements. Then he walked out, didn't wait for applause, just left the truth on the table like a loaded gun. Back in prison, Thomas felt the shift, not overnight, but he saw it in the way guards lingered longer near his door, the way inmates stepped aside in the hallway, the way Artie handed him notes now without looking nervous. Then one night, after lights out, a guard dropped a slip of paper in his cell, folded inside a playing card. It read, "The council is stalling the vote. Gino's nervous. He's asking about you by name." Thomas stared at it for a long time, then smiled. He could feel it, like warmth through concrete. They remembered, not just who he was, but what he meant, and now they were listening again. That night, Thomas lay on his bunk, hands folded over his chest, staring up into the dark. Outside, rain tapped gently on the tiny cell window. He closed his eyes and let the sound carry him back. To the streets, to the deli windows, to his brother's voice in the distance, to the weight of a child's hand in his, to the first time someone called him Tommy Shots, and meant it with respect, not fear. He wasn't young anymore, wasn't clean, but he wasn't dead. Not yet. And when you come back from silence, you don't shout, you speak slow, and the ones who matter, they lean in. The letter came folded inside a Catholic missal. Worn leather cover, yellowed pages. No one read those books anymore, not even the priests who passed them out on holy days. But this one had been left on Thomas's bunk, wrapped in a rubber band like someone dropped it by mistake. Thomas turned it over in his hands, slow and quiet. No label, no signature. Just the kind of object that carried intent, not decoration. He opened it. Nothing inside for several pages. Then, somewhere near the middle, a corner folded down, and under it, a torn piece of cloth with writing in blue penny. "The bones are still buried in the orchard. East fence, you remember?" "Sir Justin S." No date, no address, no explanation. But the moment his eyes reached that last letter, his chest tightened. Not in panic, not in fear, but in something rarer. Recognition. Because only one person ever used that signature, and he was supposed to be dead. Sal Cardinal, the consigliere, the diplomat. The quiet man who could end wars with a look and bury a body with just the absence of paperwork. Sal had been missing for months, presumed dead, maybe retired. Rumors said he vanished down to Florida with a fake passport and a pocket full of cash. Others said his body was floating somewhere between City Island and the Sound, weighted down with chains, name erased from the books. Thomas had believed the second story. Sal wouldn't run. But now, he wasn't so sure, because that letter wasn't from a ghost. It was from a tactician. The bones are still buried in the orchard. It was a code, and a damn old one. Back in the 80s, when the feds were breathing down the Colombo crew's neck over a construction fraud case in Farmingdale, Sal and Thomas had created a dead, drop system for sensitive messages. It revolved around 3 pieces. 1, the orchard, meaning Queens, specifically East Elmhurst. 2, bones, coded term for documents, not bodies. 3, East fence, a reference to a chain link gate behind an abandoned meat packing facility that Sal used for years as a hideout for secrets, cash, and 1 or 2 very valuable ledgers. If Sal was writing this now, it meant one of 3 things: he was alive. He had access to information that could flip the board. And he needed Thomas to remember. But how had the letter gotten inside? Guards were watching Thomas now. Maybe not closely, but enough. No one would risk slipping something so bold into his bunk unless they had protection on the inside. That left only two possibilities: Lou. Or someone else was playing a longer game. That evening, Thomas walked his usual laps in the yard. Wind was sharp, sky pale with winter cloud. After the fourth loop, Lou slid in beside him. "You get the book?" Lou asked casually. Thomas nodded. Lou's voice dropped. "You believe it?" Thomas kept walking. "It's him. The language, the markers. Sal never left a trail by accident." Lou shook his head, lips tight. "If he's alive, then everything they said about him was bullshit." Thomas glanced sideways. "Exactly." They walked 3 more laps. Then Thomas said, "I need to get a message out. Real message." "Ice only? That's heavy," he said. "You know what you're asking." "I do." Lou nodded slowly, then said, "You'll have it tomorrow." That night, sleep didn't come easy. Not because of fear, because of memory. Thomas lay in the dark, hands folded on his chest, listening to the creaks of the prison breathe around him. He thought of Sal. Of the first time they'd met, years ago, during a sit, down in a church basement over a spilled union job. Everyone else had been shouting. Sal had said 3 words and the entire room went silent. This isn't chess. That was Sal's gift. He didn't think 10 moves ahead. He thought in layers: emotion, history, timing, fear, and if he was sending messages now, it meant something big was hidden in those bones. The next morning, Lou passed him a book, a paperback, torn cover, of Mice and Men. Inside was a folded napkin, wrapped tight and sealed with plastic. Thomas took it back to his bunk, sat with his back to the wall, and opened it slowly. It was blank. No words, no ink, just a smell. Pine. Thomas brought the napkin to his nose, inhaled slowly. Yes, pine and mint. It was a field marker. A signal Sal had used once when passing documents through cleaners in Staten Island. That scent meant the message had already left the prison. Sal was alive, and he was pulling strings outside. That evening, the prison radio played an old Sinatra song during chow. "Send in the clowns." Someone let it roll a little longer than usual. Thomas heard it, closed his eyes and smiled. Sal had heard him. 2 days later, Lou came with a whisper. "There's talk. Trasani's nervous. The article, the blog, the letters. Word is, he's pushing to accelerate the vote." Thomas rubbed his hands together. It was cold. "What's his angle?" Lou lowered his voice. "He wants to remove you before anyone can speak up for you. Trying to buy the captains, promises of new seats, new routes, clean money." Thomas nodded. Of course he was. "Anyone biting?" Lou smirked. "Not all. Some are remembering who kept them out of the dirt." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "Then it's time to remind the rest." That night, Artie DeFranco passed Thomas a piece of torn sheet music. No envelope. No message. Just a single page from an opera score. La Traviata, a code, ancient, personal. Used only once before. During the early 90s war inside the family, when Thomas and Sal had coordinated a safe passage for 3 crew members across borough lines to prevent them from getting caught in crossfire. La Traviata meant a meeting is being arranged. And it wasn't just any meeting. It meant a seat was being cleared at the table again. Thomas closed his eyes that night and whispered, "The bones are still buried." And in his mind he saw them, pages, ledgers, names, buried under concrete, hidden in silence. Secrets Sal had been holding on to, waiting for the exact moment to play them. And that moment was now. Outside, Dino was making his own moves. With the help of Angela Frasca, the journalist, they began laying groundwork for something louder, not an article this time, a podcast, 6 parts, audio only. An anonymous narrator reading from pages of unconfirmed Colombo history. Nothing provable. All rumor. And every sentence designed to light a match under Trasani's plans. The first episode dropped under the title, Erased the Story of Tommy Shots and the Ghosts of the Family. Within 48 hours, it was the Funny 3 True Crime podcast on Spotify. Within a week, it was on radio. And within 9 days, someone left a voicemail on Angela's burner line. If Gioeli ain't out yet, it's because people are scared of what he still knows. That's it. That's the whole story. In prison, word spread fast. By week's end, inmates were quoting the podcast in the yard. Guards pretended not to hear. But Thomas knew. The tide was turning. And just before lockdown that Friday, someone he never saw who slipped a Polaroid under his pillow. It was the orchard, the real one? Queens. East fence. And spray painted on the tree. One word. Ready? Thomas leaned against the wall and smiled. It wasn't over. Not yet. In fact, it was just beginning. They scheduled the vote for Thursday. No ceremony. No formality. Just a message passed hand to hand, mouth to mouth, from the council to the captains. We meet, we decide. Julie's name on or off the books. That was it. cold, clinical, final. Inside the prison, the air felt different. Not tense like before a fight. Not quiet like before bad news, just still. Like everyone was waiting for something to break. Thomas heard the news from Artie during morning yard. It was early, sky still pale, shoes wet with dew. Artie walked up behind him, hands in his pockets, jaw tight. They're doing it Thursday. Thomas didn't turn. How many hands? Artie exhaled slowly. They're calling all 5 borough capos, plus Jersey. Of state. Trasani wants a clean vote? Thomas half smiled. That doesn't exist. No, Artie said, but it makes for good headlines. Thomas finally turned to look at him. We're private estate, upstate. You won't know the address. Who's representing me? Artie paused. That's why I'm here? Thomas squinted. Artie continued. They don't want anyone speaking for you. They say your absence is the verdict. Thomas nodded slowly. No surprise. That was Trasani's game. Control the room, control the outcome. Shut down the voice before it can speak. But silence wasn't weakness. Not with the right tools. After Artie left, Thomas walked 6 slow laps around the yard. Same path, same rhythm. But this time he was thinking. Not of revenge. Not even of power. Of memory. Because this wasn't about titles anymore. It wasn't about being a boss. It was about not being erased. They could take the name, the stripes, even the seat at the table. But they couldn't take the truth, not if he spoke first. And for the first time in years, Thomas Gioeli was ready to speak. Back in his cell, Lou waited. He'd heard the same news from another guard. Trasani's crew had been moving heavy money. Calling in favors. Promising new slices of old pies to anyone willing to vote yes. Half of them don't care, Lou said. They don't hate you. They just don't know what silence means. Thomas looked at him. Then I'll tell them. Lou narrowed his eyes. How? You said we had a way out, Thomas replied. We use it now. Lou hesitated. That means going loud. Thomas didn't blink. Then let's go loud. That night, Angela Frasco received a burner phone call at 1:14 a.m. The voice on the line was not Thomas Gioeli, but what it said had his fingerprints all over it. You want the story they're trying to vote out of history. Angela sat up in bed. I'm listening. Clear your next hour. The voice said, check your inbox. Then the line went dead. 2 minutes later, a secure file hit her encrypted email. 12 audio clips, each one labeled with a date. Each one paired with a note. If they erase me Thursday, let these speak Friday. If they don't, burn them. You owe me that much. The first clip was from 1994. A sit-down between Thomas and Sal Cardinale. You could hear the ambient noise, plates clinking, a fan spinning lazily overhead. But the voices were clear. Thomas, we don't kill unless we have to. That's the rule. That's always been the rule. Sal, Trasani wants a message sent. Thomas, Trasani wants a body. I want peace. If I take over this crew, it'll be with words first. Angela played the clip twice. Then the next one, 1997. A meeting about a missing truck of Union goods. Thomas's voice again. We clean this up in-house. Quiet. We protect the badge on the books, not the one on the coat. Then came a 2003 phone call. Thomas advising an associate not to retaliate after a cousin was shot in a bad deal. Revenge makes good stories, but it don't build foundations. We bleed when we stop thinking. You want to build something? Start by letting this one go. And on and on. 12 files. 12 moments where Thomas could have burned the world down, and chose not to. Angela called Dino, woke him up. Jesus. He said groggy. What? Tommy sent his history. There was a pause. You mean his playbook? No, Angela said. His eulogy. The Wednesday came, one day before the vote. Inside, Thomas met with Artie and Lou in the chapel. Empty, hollow, untouched by anyone who still believed in prayer. They sat in the last pew. No words for the first 5 minutes. Then Thomas said, we don't stop the vote. Lou frowned. What? We'll let it happen? Thomas said. But we make sure they hear me while they raise their hands. Artie rubbed his face. That's not how it works. You're not in the room. Thomas looked at him. I've never needed a room. Then he passed them each a folded page. Typed. Clean. Short. Exactly 232 words. Can you get this in front of them? He asked. Lou and Artie looked at each other. Then nodded. That evening, outside the prison, Angela released a final podcast episode. No title. No intro music. No narrator voice. Just Thomas's audio. From a cell, recorded on old tape, his voice low but clear. You don't have to like me. You don't have to follow me. But don't forget what I did. Not the blood I spilled. The blood I didn't. They want to erase my name because it reminds them of what we used to stand for. I never wore the crown. But I kept the peace. And when men asked me what the life meant, I told them it meant knowing when to stop the knife before it got drawn. If that means nothing now, then go ahead. Vote, clean your house with lies, but just know the dirt always comes back. Thursday morning. The vote began. An estate in Dutchess County. Closed doors, long table. Wine no one drank. Suits no one respected. Trasani walked in confident, sat at the head, no speech, just a gesture. We vote now, yes or no. Gioeli retired, forgotten. The first few hands raised, then more. A tide, but halfway through someone interrupted. A hand-delivered envelope. Passed down the table like a relic, addressed to the room. Inside, a letter. Thomas's letter. And a flash drive. They played the recording on a phone, volume low but clear. As his voice filled the room, some froze. Others looked away. But one by one, hands stopped raising. And then the tide had turned. By the time they finished listening, half the room had taken their votes back. Someone, they never said who, tore the vote sheet in half and burned it in an ashtray. And Trasani, he didn't speak. He just left the room. And that was the moment Thomas Gioeli won without being in the building. Back in his cell that night, Thomas didn't smile. Didn't pound the walls. He just sat and breathed. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, he slept without dreaming. Because his name was still written in the book. Not in ink, but in memory. It was quiet after the vote. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes not with peace, but with pause. Like the eye of a storm. Like the space between the first shot and the second. Thomas had lived long enough to know. Men don't lose gracefully in this life. They swallow the loss, nod their heads, shake your hand, and then find a darker corner to sharpen the next knife. And Gino Trasani, the man who tried to erase him, he was the kind who sharpened slow. Inside the prison, nothing changed overnight. The meals were the same. The guards didn't nod more. The hallways didn't echo any differently. But the looks, those changed. Some men watched him longer now. Some nodded with just a little more weight behind it. Others avoided eye contact altogether, because now he was the man who survived the erasure. The man who spoke when silence was expected. The man who used no bullets, only truth. And truth, in this world, could be sharper than a blade. That week, Artie told him. They dropped the vote before the final hands even raised. Thomas nodded. Trasani leave quietly? Artie smirked. No one ever does. Thomas didn't ask more. He didn't need to. Because he knew the nature of power in their world. When you rise in the wrong man's shadow, the sun becomes a target. And right now, Trasani was aiming. 2 days later, Lou brought him a whisper in the yard. He's moving money again. Quiet. Overseas. Thomas squinted. That's not a move. That's a shield out. Could be both. Thomas looked at him. Or a payout? Lou gave a slow nod. You think he's buying something? No, Thomas said. I think he's buying someone. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, the mattress too thin, the walls too close. And in his mind, he walked through every name he could remember from his old world. Who still owed Trasani favors, who still needed money, who had a brother in prison or a cousin with a habit. Then he thought of the one name that had always been a shadow, Gino's quiet knife. Bruno Vasari. Not made, not official, but a hand, the kind of guy who never showed up in photos but always showed up where bodies hit the ground. Rumor said Bruno had been contracted, not raised. Half Sicilian, half something else, cold eyes, no loyalty, just clean work. Last seen in Jersey, then gone. But Thomas knew men like Bruno didn't vanish, they just waited for the right check to clear. The warning came a day later. Angela Frasca, the journalist, sent a letter. Handwritten, untraceable envelope. No return address. Inside, a single sentence. You're not safe. Gino paid someone, and he's already inside? Nothing more. No signature. But Thomas didn't need one. He knew her writing. He read the sentence again. And then a third time. He gave no reaction. Not to the guards. Not to the other inmates. Not even to Lou. But that night, he didn't walk the yard. And at show, he sat with his back to the wall. And when someone new joined the block, a guy named Eddie Salvo, moved from another facility, supposedly on a weapons beef, Thomas watched him carefully. Eddie was clean cut. No tattoos. No scars. Too quiet for a guy who claimed to have done 5 years prior. He watched. He listened. He waited. And Thomas began watching him the same way he used to watch windows before a job. Quiet. Fixed. Ready. 2 nights later it happened. Lockdown lifted for late-night plumbing maintenance. Something Thomas had never seen happen before, especially not in C Block, where his cell sat cold in the corner. Lights dim. Doors cracked open briefly. Too briefly. It was the kind of controlled chaos that someone could walk through unnoticed if they were fast, clean, and meant to kill. Thomas didn't move, didn't panic. He stood in his cell, still dressed, hands tucked into his sleeves. And when the figure stepped in, quiet as a shadow, wearing state issue boots but not walking like a prisoner, Thomas was ready. It wasn't a fight. Not really. Because Bruno, if that's who it was, didn't expect a man in his 70s to be fast. Didn't expect the old man to already be holding the blade from a dismantled toothbrush, wrapped tight in cloth and sharpened against tile for weeks. Didn't expect him to know how to survive. The man lunged. Thomas sidestepped, blade up, one movement. Fast, deliberate. Blood hit the wall. But it wasn't Thomas's. The guards came fast. Too fast. As if they'd been nearby. As if they knew. As if they were watching the wrong side on purpose. They dragged Thomas away, yelling, cursing. But he wasn't yelling. He wasn't even breathing hard. He just looked down at the man bleeding in the corner. And said nothing. Because what was there to say? He'd been hunted, and again he survived. 2 hours later he sat in isolation again. A cold cell. No blankets. No toothbrush. Just a cot and a toilet, and a tray of food that looked like it had already been digested once. They didn't charge him. Didn't press for answers. Because the cameras had gone offline. No evidence. No name on the intruder. Just another shuffle in the system. But Thomas knew. Gino had tried. And failed. And that meant he was out of quiet options. And men like Gino, when they run out of quiet they get sloppy. 3 days passed. Thomas sat still. Didn't speak to the guards. Didn't ask questions. Didn't write letters. He just thought. And waited. Until Lou came again. This time with wide eyes and shaking hands. They found a body. Thomas said nothing. A safe house. Belonged to Gino's cousin. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Lou swallowed. Bruno Vasari. Shot in the head. Burned. But they ID'd him by dental. Thomas didn't blink. But inside, he understood what just happened. Sal had cleaned up again. From the shadows. The message was clear. They sent one. We sent one back. This wasn't a war now. This was chess in the dark. And Thomas, he still knew the board. That night, Angela posted a cryptic article. Just a headline. No body text. Ghosts don't miss twice. People knew what it meant. And even those who didn't felt it. Because now, the world wasn't watching a retired gangster waiting out his sentence. They were watching a survivor, a player still in the game. And Gino, he knew it too. Back in prison, Thomas finally slept again. Not deeply, but safely. And in his dreams, for once, he didn't see faces. He saw a table, wooden, round, clean, and at the center, his name, still carved into it. Still permanent. It arrived without warning. A manila envelope, sealed in red tape, handed to Thomas by a guard who didn't make eye contact. No return address, no stamp, just a crisp white label. Official summons. United States District Court, Eastern District of New York. Thomas took it without speaking. Sat down on the edge of his bunk. Broke the seal slowly. He didn't know what he expected. But it wasn't this. Inside was a letter. 1 page typed. Federal letterhead to Mr. Thomas Gioeli. You are hereby summoned to appear before the Eastern District Court in Brooklyn under protective escort for confidential testimony related to a series of sealed grand jury inquiries. You are not being charged. You are not under subpoena as a defendant. You are being invited as a witness of historical significance to provide context and testimony related to past Colombo family activities, unresolved disappearances, and unsolved federal investigations dating from 1980 to 2010. Your testimony may be used in pending historical record consolidations, federal archives, and truth-seeking initiatives sponsored by DOJ oversight and transparency directives. This is voluntary. If you decline, no penalty will be issued. If you accept, you will be transported under federal custody and returned within 48 hours. We are asking for the truth, Mr. Gioeli. Whatever version you're willing to leave behind. There was no name at the bottom, just a signature. Deputy Federal Archivist, not a prosecutor, an archivist. Thomas set the letter down, and for the first time in months, maybe years, he was still, truly still. Because this wasn't a trap. This wasn't an indictment. This was something else, something stranger. Something that tasted like irony and dust. They wanted his story. He waited until lights out to speak to Lou. They sat in the dark, back against the wall, voices low. They want you to talk. Lou asked, confused. Like a rat? Thomas shook his head. No, not names. Not deals. They want history. Lou raised an eyebrow. History. Thomas nodded. They're putting together a record. Truth commissions. Closure reports. Old cases they'll never try. Files they want to close with a story. Lou squinted. So they want you to write your own ending. Thomas didn't answer. Because he wasn't sure? Not yet. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat at the edge of his cot, hands hanging between his knees, staring at the floor. He thought about time. The slow kind that crawled, the kind that turned loyalty into silence and silence into mythology. He thought about what he'd left behind. The streets, the men, the cold rules no one wrote down but everyone obeyed. He thought about what came next, not parole, not release, not some fairy tale ending. Just memory. and who got to keep it. By morning he made his decision. He told the guard, "I'll go." 3 days later, 2 federal marshals arrived. Plain clothes, black SUV. They didn't cuff him, just opened the back door and said, "Sir." He stepped in. They drove in silence. Out of the prison gates, across the flat roads of upstate New York, into the heart of Brooklyn where everything had started. Thomas watched the city through the tinted glass. It looked older now. Not in the buildings, not in the streets, in him, because this wasn't the city he'd grown up in. This was the graveyard of that city. The courthouse hadn't changed. Still cold, still gray, still pretending it didn't remember the ghost that sat inside it. They led him through a private entrance. No cameras, no reporters, no cuffs, just long hallways and longer silences. He was placed in a small conference room with cream-colored walls and a steel table bolted to the floor. There was no jury, no judge. Just 2 people waiting. One was a federal archivist, glasses, sweater, file folder thick as a Bible. The other was a woman in a suit who didn't smile. She introduced herself only as oversight counsel. They offered water. Thomas refused. The archivist cleared his throat. "Mr. Gioeli, you don't have to say anything today. You can walk out. But if you stay, we'd like to talk about the things that never made it into the books." Thomas tilted his head. "Which books?" "All of them." They started slow. Questions about the structure, not the people, but the process. How did information move? How did sit-downs work? Why were certain rules respected even when power changed? Thomas answered softly. Not with secrets, but with context. Because after all these years, what mattered wasn't who did what. It was why it had been allowed to happen. They asked about disappearances, not accusations, just gaps, guys who were there and then weren't. Thomas gave them silences, pauses that filled in blanks. He never said names. But his eyes told stories. Then the archivist asked, "Why didn't you run?" Thomas looked up. "What?" "When you were indicted, when they had names, tapes, bodies. You could have skipped. A lot of men did. Why stay?" Thomas leaned back, stared at the ceiling. Then he said softly, "Because I wasn't finished." The questions continued for 2 hours, and Thomas, he didn't confess, he clarified. He spoke like an old teacher walking students through a subject they'd only ever read about in newspapers. The spacing between power and survival, the quiet difference between a soldier and a capo, the unspoken truths no law ever really understood. "You think the mob was about greed," he said once. "It was about certainty. Men want to know how the world works, who's safe, who's not. We gave them that." The council listened. Sometimes they scribbled, but mostly they let him speak, because the truth wasn't in the facts, it was in the tone. Before he left, the archivist slid him a blank piece of paper. "You don't have to write anything," he said, "but if you had one sentence to leave behind, something for the record, we'll seal it. Forever. Not for court, not for evidence, just for closure." Thomas stared at the page. For a long time, he didn't move. Then he picked up the pen and wrote, "I never wanted to be remembered, just not rewritten." They drove him back that night. Same car. Same silence. As they passed the Manhattan skyline, Thomas looked out the window, eyes half closed, and whispered to himself, "Not rewritten." He knew they would tell his story however they pleased. Some would still call him a killer. Some would still paint him as a myth. Some would forget him altogether. But for one brief moment, in a quiet federal room, he'd spoken for himself. And that mattered. Back in prison, Lou was waiting. Thomas handed him the official papers. Lou skimmed them. "You told them everything?" "No," Thomas said. "I told them enough." Lou folded the letter, nodded once, then said, "You look lighter." Thomas smirked. "I left some weight behind." That night, sleep came faster, deeper. Not peace, but something close to completion. Because for the first time, he didn't feel like a name in someone else's story. He felt like the ending no one expected. Winter rolled over the city like a slow fog. Cold mornings turned colder nights, and in the prison yard, breath hung in the air like ghosts with nowhere else to be. Thomas sat near the corner wall, hands in his sleeves, eyes unfocused. He didn't walk much anymore. Didn't need to. There were no more messages to send, no more territory to hold, no more truth to offer anyone who hadn't already made up their mind. He was still standing, still breathing, still a name. And that was its own kind of victory. But the strange thing was, it didn't feel like one. He got the letter on a Tuesday. Plain envelope, no return. Just his name. Just a single folded page. Inside was handwriting he hadn't seen in decades. Old, angry, desperate. "You think they remember you as clean. But I know what you buried. You walked away like your hands didn't drip. You want forgiveness, old man. Try asking the ones you left behind." Gino signature needed. Gino Trassani had finally dropped the mask. And for the first time, Thomas didn't feel anger. He felt emptiness. He kept the letter. Didn't tear it. Didn't reply. Just folded it neatly, slid it under his mattress. And that night he didn't sleep. Because there was something in those words that dug deeper than any bullet ever had. Not the threat. Not even the accusation. Just that one word. Forgiveness. He hadn't thought about it much. Not really. In his world, forgiveness was never the goal. You asked for silence. You bought loyalty. You earned fear. You paid for peace. But forgiveness, that belonged to a different life. A civilian's life. And yet, now sitting in this cold room with nothing but shadows and memories, it was the only word that felt like unfinished business. The next day, a guard passed him a phone. No explanation. Just handed it to him in the hallway. 2 minutes, the guard said. Thomas lifted it slowly. On the other end, a voice he hadn't heard in over 30 years, female. Steady. Not soft, not hard, just real. Tommy, she said. He swallowed hard. Anna. She was his niece. His older brother's daughter. He hadn't spoken to her since 1993. The year her father was found dead in his car, engine still running, mouth duct tape, eyes open. A message, but a confusing one, because no one ever found out who the message was for. Anna had blamed him, and maybe she was right. Now all these years later, her voice came through clear, and she wasn't calling to reconcile. She was calling to say one thing. I read your words. The court thing, the recording, that sentence you wrote. And a long pause. You're still trying to be remembered, Uncle Tommy, but it won't mean anything until you stop pretending we don't remember why we left. He tried to speak, but there was no defense that didn't feel like a lie. So he said nothing. And then she said, if you want forgiveness, you have to admit you wanted it. Click. She hung up. That night, Thomas stared at the ceiling for hours. Not thinking about courtrooms. Not thinking about Gino. Not thinking about the books or the votes or the codes. He thought about his brother's funeral. He'd shown up in a black suit, black coat, no tears. People had stepped aside like he carried the disease of death in his skin. He remembered Anna standing by the casket. Small, furious, 14 years old. He'd tried to talk to her. She wouldn't look at him. Wouldn't say his name. And he never tried again. The day after the call, Thomas asked Lou a question he'd never asked before. You got people out there who forgave you? Lou looked up, surprised. Some, he said. But not many, and none who matter? Thomas gave a soft laugh. That's the thing. The ones who matter are the ones you lost the deepest. Lou didn't answer, just nodded and walked away. By Friday, a new visitor showed up on the schedule. A priest, one Thomas didn't know. Young, maybe mid-30s, clean face, no judgment in his eyes. He came into the room and sat across from Thomas. Didn't open a Bible, didn't ask for confession. He just said, she called me. The girl, Anna. Thomas, she asked if I could talk to you. The priest said, not about heaven, about grief. Thomas tilted his head. Whose grief? The priest looked him in the eyes. Yours, Thomas scoffed quietly. I'm not grieving, I'm still alive. The priest leaned forward. That doesn't mean you didn't bury yourself decades ago. Thomas didn't reply. Because deep down, he knew. They sat together for 30 minutes. No prayers, no sermons, just long, slow conversation about loss. The kind you cause, the kind you carry, the kind that shapes your name long after you're gone. And at the end, the priest handed Thomas a photo. Small, black and white. Anna, a child, smiling on her dad's shoulders. Underneath, a note written in soft pencil. You were family before you were anything else. Try to remember. That night, Thomas wrote a letter. No legal strategy, no name dropping, no justifications, just a single page. Anna, I won't say I didn't make choices that led us here. I won't ask you to pretend I was a good man. But I remember your father. I remember the day you were born. I remember his voice when he told me he'd named you after our mother. I don't know if I ordered that hit. I was surrounded by so many fires then. Some I lit, some I didn't. But I watched every one burn. I'm sorry. Not for what I did, but for what I never tried to undo. If you can carry that with you, good. If not, I understand. I'm not asking to be forgiven. I'm asking not to be forgotten for the wrong reasons. He signed it Thomas. Not Uncle. Not Capo. Not Tommy Schatz. Just a man trying to unwrite a silence. He passed the letter to Lou. No explanation. Lou asked no questions. Just nodded and sent it out. That weekend, a rumor spread in the yard. Gino was sick. Some said it was cancer. Others said stroke. Still others said it was poison, slow and untraceable. But no one knew for sure, only that he'd stopped making calls. Stopped showing up. Stopped sending checks. And Thomas, he didn't smile. Didn't celebrate. He just sat by the wall, same bench, same coat, and whispered, we all vanish differently. That evening, a guard brought him a second letter. Different handwriting. Familiar but older. You gave me something. I don't forgive you yet. But I don't hate your voice anymore. That's something. Thomas held the letter for a long time, then folded it, placed it beside the priest's photo, and let out a breath that felt older than his bones. He hadn't asked for peace, but some part of him, the part that wasn't made or raised or blood-bound, finally let go, not of guilt, not of memory, but of that constant weight pressing on his name. It was almost time. The final piece was coming. He could feel it, and he was ready now, not to fight but to face it. It was Sunday, the kind of Sunday the old Italians used to respect, slow, gray, gentle with its hours. No noise, just the soft hum of quiet things. Thomas sat in the yard, same corner, same bench, coat buttoned up to the neck. The cold didn't bite as hard anymore, maybe because he no longer fought it. He looked out at the fences, the empty trees beyond them. No wind, no birds, just stillness. And for the first time in a long while he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. There had been no more attempts. No late-night hits. No secret threats. No more letters from Gino. Rumors said he was dying, lungs shot, cancer in the bone, too proud for a hospital, too stubborn to pray. If that was true, Thomas didn't celebrate. He just let it be. Because he'd already learned the final lesson men like them rarely get to understand. Not all endings are about survival. Some are about surrendering the fight and still being whole. The priest came again. Not to preach, just to sit. They talked about music, about old cars, about the smell of fresh bread on Sundays in Brooklyn. And then the priest asked a final question. Do you think you were a good man, Thomas? Thomas didn't blink, didn't look away. He answered slow. I think I tried to be after it was too late. The priest nodded, like that was the most honest thing he'd ever heard in that room. And maybe it was. That night, Thomas pulled out the last letter he'd written but never sent, addressed to no one, unsigned. It read, there was a time I believed silence was strength, that not speaking kept you safe. But I understand now that silence is just a grave you dig while standing up. I lived a long life. I wore names I didn't earn, and I lost people I never deserved to have in the first place. But I tried to be honest in the end. I tried to leave something behind that wasn't soaked in blood or fear. If you find this, whoever you are, just know that I remembered. All of it, even the parts I never said out loud. That he folded the letter, slipped it between the pages of the old Catholic missal that still sat under his mattress, the one where Sal had hidden his first message. The next morning, he didn't get up at the usual time, didn't walk the yard, didn't drink his coffee. By 9:30 a.m., the guard came knocking on the cell door. Gioeli, no answer. The door was opened, and there Thomas lay, peacefully, quietly on his side, one arm folded under his cheek, eyes closed. Just stillness. They said it was natural. Heart probably. Nothing violent. Just a man whose clock had finished ticking. Word spread slow. The younger inmates didn't react. Most didn't even know his name beyond rumors. But the older ones, they nodded quietly to themselves, some even saying a prayer under their breath, because they knew. They'd seen what he survived. They'd watched how he carried it. And they understood what it meant to walk away from the edge still whole, even if that edge followed you until your last breath. Angela Frasca got the news 2 days later. She wrote a single-line tribute, posted it with no image, no quote, no audio. Thomas Gioeli died as he lived quiet in the end, thunder in the middle. The podcast spiked again. Listeners old and new returned to hear his voice, not to judge, not to glorify, but to understand, to walk through that quiet corridor where violence, loyalty, and survival blurred, where a gangster could also be a man, where legend fell away, and what was left was just truth. Anna got a letter too, handwritten by Lou. Included was the photo she'd sent, the one with her on her father's shoulders, and one more page folded behind it. Her uncle's handwriting. Unsent until now. You were the only part of this life I regret walking away from. Not the cruise, not the money, not the blood, just you. I carried the guilt, but I never had the courage to put it down. If you ever speak my name, speak it for that reason. But because I was right. But because I remembered what it meant to love someone I didn't deserve. She cried reading it, not because it fixed anything, but because it didn't try to. It just owned the wound. And sometimes that's the most healing thing a person can do. Lou lit a candle in the chapel that night. Didn't say much, just whispered. You made it to the end, old man. With your name still yours. He slipped the last of Thomas's letters into a small envelope. Filed it into a folder labeled, Unfiled Accounts Gioeli T. Not for the court, not for the feds, not even for history. Just in case someone someday needed to hear that even monsters know how to speak gently before they sleep. And so, Thomas Gioeli faded into that soft space between fact and legend, not buried as a boss, not martyred as a killer, not forgotten as a ghost, but remembered fully, flawed sharp. Still, Brooklyn moved on. New names rose. New crews fought for pieces of what once belonged to men like Thomas. But in some corners of Bensonhurst and Sheepshade Bay, old men at barbershops still spoke his name softly. Tommy Shots.
Yeah, I knew him, never loud.
Always watching. Took his hits but never swung first unless he had to. I'll tell you one thing. That man outlived more bullets than I've seen in movies, and somehow died with peace on his face. And maybe that's the only ending a man like him ever needed. Not a parade, not a gravestone etched in gold, not a headline, just peace. After all that fire, after all those shadows, sleep, without ghosts,